Hello, I'm Mary McNaughton, Gabrielle Jungels-Winkler Director of the Ruth Chandler Williamson Gallery at Scripps College in Claremont, California. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this program in connection with the exhibition Mirror, Mirror, the Prints of Alison Saar from the collections of Jordan D. Schnitzer and his family foundation. The exhibition is now on view at the Williamson Gallery at Scripps College until December 6, 2020. Owing to the coronavirus pandemic, this fall, teaching at Scripps is being done remotely, and the gallery is currently closed until restrictions are lifted. However, today we are going to give you an introduction to the exhibition, and we're delighted to participate in Scripps Presents Fall 2020 season. For support, we thank Scripps Presents and the Clark Lectureship Fund. As the name of the exhibition reveals, Jordan D. Schnitzer and his family foundation generously provided works from Schnitzer's immense collection, one often featured in museum exhibitions. The first comprehensive survey of Alison Saar's prints, Mirror, Mirror, presents more than 30 prints chosen from Saar's enormous portfolio of work created over the past 35 years, as well as selected recent sculptures. We're grateful to Jordan D. Schnitzer and his family foundation for organizing and sponsoring this in-depth exhibition and producing a catalog raisonné of Alison Saar's prints. Thanks to Jordan Schnitzer's support, this exhibition is being seen at several college and university museums.
It is a rare opportunity to have Alison with us to talk about the works in this exhibition, and that will be what we will focus on for the next few minutes. Well, Alison, let's talk about your work. This piece is extraordinary, powerful. It's at the entrance to the exhibition, and it is in woodcut. What is so powerful, of course, is the image itself, this strong figure, and you combine it with this powerful palette. Could you say something about the way you combine your images and your materials to make your expressive statement?
Yeah, well, I think, the main thing about this piece is she's huge. And, this is first, whenever you go into a print studio and someone has a big press, you're like, oh my God, let's pull out some 6-foot pieces of wood and see what we can do. So that was really a wonderful opportunity working with Angela's Press and Toby Michelle on that. But I think as a sculptor and, I think some of the earlier pieces I did were, woodcuts on just like found pieces of wood, such as the pieces on the other side of this wall, the Arcade series. Those were made out of an old drawer that I busted up. I busted up a chiffero, and we had little pieces of wood that, were really great quality wood. But I had the tools, and at the time I could make woodcuts with just, a Bayer and a Baron, and, that's all you really needed. So I loved that it was something that I didn't need an outside facility to realize. And then, I was also not only looking at Elizabeth Catlett, but looking at German Expressionists, who also had this parallel of sculpture and, really kind of roughly hewn. The blade is very apparent. And then also with their woodcuts are similar in terms of just still really roughly hewn. So I think, those were hugely influential as well. But
there's a wordplay sometimes in your titles that is so interesting. You call her Sweeping Beauty. So you kind of refer to this history of domestic service and servitude and
right, and this sort of romanticization and mythology of the roles of women. Sweeping Beauty, of course, was just too pretty for her own good, and got into all that trouble with her wicked stepmother or whatever she was. Yeah. So, and I'm embarrassed because my father used to say the pun is the lowest form of humor, but I love puns, so hence Sweeping Beauty. And, she's kind of in this sort of cave, but also kind of feels like this kind of her casket thing, because, right, she lived in this kind of glass casket and, this sort of dark, brambly business that goes around her sort of thing. So, so her hair has become this broom. And you'll see as we go around that these images come up. A lot of, people would call them in lynchings. I kind of consider them inverted lynchings, which in some ways talks about how we relinquish ourselves to things that are kind of beyond our control. Sometimes we're put in positions because of bigoted or racist policies, but there's always this sense at what point do we surrender to them. And so I think a lot of the works kind of play with that. That's what a lot of these inverted figures are pointing to.
And we'll see them throughout the exhibition, so let's
All
go
right,
through
sounds
and
great.
talk about some other things that are important to you.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so after, I had worked with Paul Darrow here at Scripps, I kind of abandoned printmaking for a while and was really focusing on sculpture. And it was not until I was invited by Vinyl Haven Press up in Maine that I really had an opportunity to kind of like get reintroduced to printmaking. It was the first time I was working with a full studio of professionals, which is so wonderful, since part of my problem as a printmaker is I am really messy, so it's nice to have someone kind of keep everything together. And what also I loved about Vinyl Haven Press was that they're totally experimental, and I think that can be said of all of the print studios that I've worked with, that the more open they are to kind of experimentation with materials and processes, the happier I am. So for example, these 3 prints, which were all done in around the same time, or all done with Vinyl Haven Press, was you could see from Blue Plate Special to Blue Plate Special 2, or however it is, it's the same imagery, but using different materials that I thought brought different things to it. So in this case, I had brought up a piece of ceiling tin from New York City, and we made a lithography plate of the ceiling tin, and then we superimposed this etching piece on top of it. And generally studios will want to be either this or that, but they're just like, oh, sure, whatever you want to do. And so this was kind of an interesting experiment in working with those 2 things. But on the other hand, we did this woodcut version of it, which is basically this one blue piece, and you'll see as we go through, I have a really limited palette, or maybe a signature palette, I should say, and this kind of beautiful indigo Prussian ultramarine blue is maybe one of the mainstays. But the best thing about Vinyl Haven is that they had a public dump, and so I got to go to the dump, and what this little scarf is, which is basically tucked in, is the back of a pressed oak rocking chair. And so we just took that and we made a plate, I think it was a litho plate off of that, and then we're able to print these and cut them and then just stick them so they're actually 3-dimensionalized. So I think as a sculptor, flatness has always been a real challenge for me. And so I try to, if not, the woodcut kind of does it because it has a physical dimensionality to it. But, whenever I'm doing lithos or doing, even etchings, I really try to kind of push the envelope and try to get something more physical and involved in it. And so the other piece that I did with Vinyl Haven Press was this piece, Snake Man, which is part of the Scripps collection, which is really wonderful. And what I loved about this, and again, it's still super simple, it's just like a yellow with this kind of yellow pattern on the back. The mouth and the snake are basically a cutout puzzle piece that we just dropped in, so we didn't have to run 2 separate things. But the body of this kind of has this sort of like reptilian sort of texture to it. And what it was a piece of linoleum that I'd found that was all curled up. And when you straightened it out, it had all those cracks and crevices in it. So this was really a great opportunity to let me know that I could use these found things, these textures, whether they're real or illusioned, that you could kind of bring these things. And part of my love for materials and the work, which we'll see, is that they have this history to them and a previous life to them. And so I was really happy to have the opportunity to explore that and bring that into the print work. All right, so I kind of wanted to also touch base on sort of the interplay between sculpture and prints. Normally, I'll do the sculpture and I kind of have these prints as an intermezzo, as a point of kind of rethinking graphically. Sculpture has its constrictions that you can't have things around it, you can't control what's the environment. And Also that they take a lot of time and they end up costing a lot of money, and what I love about prints is that they're really more readily available. And also the sculptures, because I'm using chainsaws, my arms get tired, so it's nice to actually have some kind of quiet, peaceful time to work on the woodcuts, and kind of, it's sort of this sort of downtime before I'm ready to jump into the next piece. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this piece called Washtub Blues, which was printed by Bud Shark. So the Women of the West Museum, which unfortunately never was able to get off the ground, but it was great because it was a beautiful suite and I got to have some really great prints out of it. And I was interested in kind of looking, and this again, you'll see as we go around, throughout time, I kind of return to these images of women and women who are working. And so this is the case, Washtub Blues. It's a washerwoman, and she's kind of looking into this washtub, and her reflection of herself is coming through. So part of the inspiration for this piece was a really amazing Roy de Carava photograph. And it's just the back of a man whose shirt has been torn and then painstakingly sewn back together. And to me, that spoke of, the labor he had, of the, minimal amount of money he was receiving from that labor, and then the love of the family, whether he sewed it. I don't want to assume that his wife sewed it. He could have sewn it himself, but this idea that you take what you have and you repair what you have, and you get as much life out of an object as he had. And that print is just such a singular, simple image, but really stuck with me and was really powerful. So I wanted to only be able to see her back, and also because a lot of these women, they're completely anonymous. Women that are working in households today, they come in the back door, they leave out the back door. They know their first name. A lot of times these women, their employers don't even know their last name. And so I thought it was really important to kind of pay tribute to, especially for African American communities and generations, on, whose shoulders we stand on. And, by the labor of their, often just using their backs to lift and move and do hard labor. So in some ways, it's a tribute to all of those who have gotten us to this point here and now. And so it wasn't until 2020 that I created this piece, Sorrow's Kitchen, and the title of that is coming from a Zora Neale Hurston excerpt. I've been to Sorrow's kitchens and I've licked all the pots clean, or something along that. Excuse my poor paraphrasing, but I love this, that she's kind of, again, gazing into this pot, and if you stand on your tippy toes, or maybe, you can actually see that she's seeing her reflection in this pot. In this case, it being the soup pot. In the case for this, it being dirty dish or dirty laundry water, and here kind of looking in this sort of soup pot, and you think of soup and pot liquor and all those things, and kind of reflecting and seeing, again, the labors of being in the kitchen, but kind of beyond that, just sort of the labors of Black women in America, and how they've kind of really been largely responsible for nourishing us, physically and spiritually as well. This is a woodcut I did called Delta Do, and again, I wanted to kind of talk about how it's just really a very simple woodcut, this black woodcut of the figure that was basically jigsawed out, and then the mouth is a little linoleum stamp, and but then all of these bottles were printed on a really beautiful like silk gampi, which I love because it has, sometimes I use it because it looks like skin. I use it because it can be a veil over certain things, and in this case we printed all these bottles and then tore them out individually and chine-collated them on top. So again, it's an example of kind of creating, that sort of physical layering, being able to see the branches through the bottle by using a really thin material. So I really like to play a lot with papers, and a lot of the papers I use are Japanese papers. I kind of tend to shy away from traditional printmaking papers just because they just feel very staid, but the Japanese paper, you can see the grain in the paper, and you can see, they just have all these varieties of translucency and thickness, and some of them look very handmade. So the paper is also a really important part of the process. So in around 2013, a few years after Katrina had gone through, I had gotten a grant to do a residency in New Orleans, and It had been some time after Katrina, but still I was kind of on my bike ride from the Esplanade down to through the Treme, going into the French Quarter where my studio was. You know, I was going past house after house. It had the red X's still painted on the door post-Katrina, and basically all these homes that were flooded. And you know, you recall at the moment the horror of the actual flood and the aftermath and the way African American and communities of color were mistreated in that. But then, you know, you also remember all of those promises that New Orleans is going to be built back better than ever. And, you know, we had issues with the politicians that ended up being crooks, and we had issues with FEMA not really doing their part. And it was just one disappointment after the other. And so, you know, when I was then in New Orleans and doing this ride, I kept on thinking of all these unfulfilled promises, and how just heartbreaking it was, because when they said they were going to build New Orleans better than ever, it meant wider than ever, that they used this as an instrument to kind of move the Black community and the community of color out of New Orleans in a certain respect. And so I had started doing these drawings. I had found these beautiful sugar sacks at Pasadena flea market and had taken them there. Those were the only materials I took, and I started doing these sketches on them, and had created actually this ceramic head, which is basically I made the head to make a mold to do blown glass pieces in it, but then somehow we managed to get the clay out of the mold and were able to fire it. So I did this piece called Cotton Eater. So I made this sculpture, the Cotton Eater, and I was kind of thinking at the time of Odysseus and the story of going to the island where the lotus eaters were, and this notion that they were eating this lotus fruit, which basically made them forget their homes, made them less homesick, and they were basically lethargic or just stoned out of their gourd and just happy to just hang out on this island and not kind of push forward, and kind of how they were kind of like lulled into this sort of druggy complacency. And so I really kind of started to think about that was kind of what was happening with New Orleans, that we were all kind of mesmerized into that somehow things were going to be made better, and we kind of believed these lies. It was kind of like let them eat cake sort of attitude, that, you know, give them a little something to keep them going, you know, these false promises, and, you know, everything will calm down. And so that's really what kind of brought me to this image of this figure eating cotton, cotton being, you know, it'll fill your stomach, but, you know, it's basically, you know, you'll starve to death eating it because it has no nutritional value. And so it's this idea of kind of feeling full but not being basically fed. And then that kind of led to this figure of a female figure eating cotton. And you can see she looks like she's pregnant, but it's actually the distended of her stomach from starvation or being famine. And so I then took, after having done these drawings on sugar sacks, I found this beautiful old quilt that had a cotton or sugar sack lining to it. So you think of traditional sugar sack quilts were all patterned and all of that, and we have some here further in the show. But these ones were just the plain white sacks, and you can see here it's C&H sugar sort of thing. But all of these seams were part of the original seams of sewing these things to be the liner of this quilt. And it's so thin and so sheer, you can see on the edges, you can see the paper coming through, which to me, you know, they had all these stains on it and these tears on it, you know, just they'd been slept on, probably people made love on it, maybe even babies were born on it, sort of thing. And it looked like it had been handed down in generations. So I created this block for the series, which ended up only being 6, because that was the only amount that we could get out of this one quilt, was 2 sideways and 1 on the top. So it was a very limited edition, which we were then able to go back and print on paper to make a larger edition. But I really got intrigued with this material that had this beautiful history, that it had been worn and worn thin, almost where it's like transparent, and that it was cotton in itself, and the notion that the material actually came from, you know, one of the major slave crops in the United States as well. And so here she is kind of eating this cotton. You know, they're flowers, but they also feel kind of like poisonous in a certain respect as well. So this is the print cotton eater. While a lot of my work deals with politics, looking specifically at issues of race and issues of gender, every once in a while the story becomes very deeply personal, and that brings me to this piece, Mirror, Mirror, which is kind of a self-portrait, I guess. I think being biracial, but being perceived as being white because of the fairness of my skin and my hair or whatnot, I always kind of feel like I live between these two worlds. And so I created this little sculpture. It's titled Mirror, Mirror, or Mulattoes Seeking Inner Negress, because for me, growing up with my mother's family, it was always, identified, and those were the things that I loved, the music, the food. That was where I really felt kind of rooted in my mother's ancestry. And so for this piece, she's holding up a skillet, and then when you come around the sculpture and look, you see the skillet is a mirror, and she sees her reflection, or she's seeking her black self, which is not visible by the parents, which is not visible through her skin. And so then I then decided to do a print version of this, also at Tandem Press, again on one of these beautiful sugar sacks. So I should say that each of these pieces are unique in that all these sugar sacks are completely different. Some of them have bigger holes, some of them have better stains. People could choose which ones they want. I love that we kind of just had like these little strings dangling out and tears in them, this tear in the fabric. But again, this is a portrait from the back, and so you don't see her face except for this reflection in the skillet that she's holding up. Another series I did at Tandem Press was this sort of suite of 4 prints on handkerchiefs. And I think the first one really relates a lot to Mirror, Mirror, in that it's kind of a self-portrait, and it's really kind of looking at this sort of myth of the tragic mulatto, or whether, it's kind of a flip in some ways. You think of Nella Larsen's writing in terms of this, light-skinned woman who has all these opportunities, but also in some ways feels divorced or somehow separated from the true Black experience because, she's kind of has to make a choice between these two worlds. And so in this case, this series really talks about sort of, degrees of the color of your skin and how you're treated, both within the Black community and outside of that Black community. And you think kind of historically, women that were allowed into Hollywood, you look at Lena Horne or whatnot, were all because they're very light-skinned. Those that could pass would definitely pass. I think in my mother's generation, passing was something that was a survival rate. But for me, coming into this world, looking as white, and definitely reaping some of the privileges of that as well. But so I did this series of 4 handkerchiefs, and so the light-skinned figure is called High Yellow Blues, and so they all kind of relate to this color. And these were these beautiful found handkerchiefs. Each one is individual. They're all hand tatted. They're very much about finery, and it really kind of reflects, her privilege and her ability to kind of, be sort of the lighter, class that, were more easily employed and were often treated differently, and sometimes kind of imposed a sort of hierarchy within the race. That I know in New Orleans there's something called the brown paper bag test, that if you were darker than a brown paper bag, you weren't getting into a club. And so there were all these restrictions even within the African American community about if you were lighter, you were somehow better. And so kind of looking at her, and then her kind of sister would be this piece, which is called Indigo Blues. And so while these were these beautiful found antique handkerchiefs, this was one that I made. I hand tatted it, I hand sewed all of the edges, and it's from a sugar sack. So each one is a little different with the different varieties of sugar. And then I also dyed them with indigo. And what I love about indigo, and that's part of what this huge sort of color scheme is for me, is that it's like magic. When you dye something with indigo, it comes out green, and then when it hits the oxygen, it turns blue. And so it's just like, what? And so it was really wonderful making this stuff. But I loved also that indigo, again, is one of the major, one of the 5 major slave crops in the United States. And so, so her, because she has darker skin, she's got, you know, her handkerchief is just something sewn from a scrap of fabric that had been recycled. So then I came back and did to complete the second part of the series, which are these two male figures. And Redbone Blues was printed on these beautiful found handkerchiefs that reminded me a lot of my father's handkerchiefs, which that was my job, was to iron his handkerchiefs when I was growing up. And so again, him being lighter skinned, he has certain privileges to employment and all these other things, that being, you know, a fairer skin, quote unquote, that he was, you know, had more opportunities. And then to go to the other one, this is called Coal Black Blues. And so what he's printed on is actually a real shop rag. I had found, it was interesting because Tandem Press is housed in Northwestern train turnaround, basically where they would put the trains in and physically turn them around. And so I found this Northwestern insignia that they would put on their safety rags, which says, "Stay alert, stay alive." And it really kind of reflected, we were just at the time really moving into, you know, some of the activity, Black Lives Matters in protest of the abuse and the murder of African American men, women, and children by the police forces. And so for me, this piece actually, at the time it was being done, and because I found this "Stay Alert and Stay Alive" really started to take on another whole other meaning, or got gathered up in that in this movement that we're experiencing now. Hopefully we will see some resolutions and some movement forward in this department. But again, so he's just on this kind of like greasy shop rag, you know, showing that, you know, if you were a fairer skin, you would maybe have a porter job. But if you were a darker skin, then you were there behind the scenes keeping the trains running, sort of thing, but you were never allowed to be in a public visible space. So these two pieces were part of a series that I was, again, going back and looking at Katrina, which then led me to the Great Mississippi Flood of 1926-27, and to kind of, again, see these correlations between, you know, the moving of sharecroppers up onto the levees, where they were basically kept there so that they couldn't, flee the south and go north, because that was their labor force. And so they were basically sort of interned on these levees. And I think of that image of the African Americans that were left stranded on the highway overpasses. And to me, there was such a strong connection. And so I did this series, starting with this figure, Breach, where she's a figure that's kind of like standing on this raft but has all of her belongings stacked upon her head. And it's talking about, you know, the strength and resilience, basically everything you own is being balanced on your head, and kind of also kind of referring to, you know, the practice of carrying things on your head, not only from different countries in Africa and different countries in South America, South and Central America, but this, you know, this sort of, you know, strength in her, able to kind of hold up her entire world. So they become kind of like these curious sort of atlases. And then I later did this piece, Staunch, as the male counterpart of that. And during the Great Mississippi Flood, African American males were conscripted to rebuild the levees. So they were, one, unable to help their family evacuate, and two, if they were caught not working on the levee, they could be shot on sight. And so it was, again, this sort of like forced labor to work on trying to save everyone else's, but by shoring up the levees. And so he's basically carrying all of the tools that would be shoring up a levee. And part of those tools would be the sandbags, which are here, which would actually be made out of these sags that they're actually been printed upon. So I love that it kind of came full circle, that the materials, and many of these are from like the 20s and 30s, could actually have been used for sandbags at the time. So he's got all of his tools, and she basically is taking care of all the household stuff. This is one of the few etchings in the exhibition. It's material that I don't go to naturally because it's just something I need a lot of help with. But I printed this with Paul Maloney in San Francisco. And this really came out of a series of work I was doing that actually started with a small print that's represented in this collection. I had met Evie Shockley up at Vermont Studio Center, an amazing poet. And I'd showed her, I'd given her actually a little print called Girl with the Pearly Earring that was kind of looking at Topsy, who is one of the characters from Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she said, oh, I'm doing a series of poems about Topsy. So that led to a collaboration in terms of her book, Semi-Automatic, that I did some drawings for. And then that got me really reinvested in this Topsy figure, who I've kind of come back and forth with. And I always loved that, you know, she's kind of sort of depicted in the book as this sort of goblin problem child. And, you know, Beatrice Stowe was saying, well, she became that way because of all her abuse and misuse as a child, you know, being taken away from her family and all that. But what I loved about her was she kind of has a sort of puckish presence, in that she has this wisdom that kind of goes beyond these constraints. And I love in the story, at one point, I think Eva is on her deathbed, and everything Eva represents with her blonde hair and her white skin and her sweet, beautiful, benevolent nature is kind of Topsy's being portrayed as the negative of that. She has goblin-like tails over her braids, and she's dark-skinned, and she's, you know, thieving and selfish. And so while little Eva is on her deathbed, she's passing out strands of her golden hair. And, you know, this is kind of viewed, I think it's been talked about that it was kind of really her sort of gifting Christianity to the slaves. And, you know, that they will be saved by Christianity. And I decided that Topsy, in her own, you know, kind of wild, true to form self, decides, well, if this hair is magical, I don't want a few strands, I'm going to take the entire scalp. So this piece is called Topsy and the Golden Fleece, again going back to the Odyssey. And instead of it being a lion, golden sheep's fleece, she's holding the scalp of poor Miss Eva. So this is a piece I made called The White Guys, and it started as a sculpture that is also part of this exhibition, which is great to be able to see them side by side. But as I was doing this sort of Topsy series, and it was a series of female figures wielding the weapons of the tools of their crop, which had then become weapons. And so, as shown in Topsy and the Golden Fleece, she's holding a sickle, which is a tool for harvesting rice. And then I thought, oh, but this other faction is light-skins, often biracial slaves that were working within the house. Often they were the offspring of the master from an illegitimate from the raping of their own slaves, basically. And so I wanted to kind of have her be this sort of like invisible presence, this sort of like, you know, she's in the house and she could kind of then kind of relate all the info to the back. So she's a spy in the master's house. And so her tool is an iron, but I kind of created this wallpaper of these cotton bowls, and you can see it coming through. So she's basically sort of like invisible. So because she's of light skin, they don't see her as kind of the other per se, and she can kind of get by. And she's got her hair is tied with these cotton bowls, which the beginning of the series was called High Cotton, which is again all these little girls coming out of this cotton field, and they've tied cotton bolts to their hair as camouflage. So they're kind of coming up through the cotton, and they each are holding the tool of their trade. So we had a sickle for rice, we had a tobacco knife for the tobacco, we had a hoe for indigo, we had a cane knife for sugar cane, and then the fifth one would be cotton, which we had a cotton bale hook. So they all, I think Audre Lorde said that you can't bring down the master's house with the master's tools. I'm paraphrasing it, but I said, oh, well, maybe you can if you take those tools and become weapons. And so if you look closely on the tip of her iron, there's a little drip of blood. So probably the most recent series of prints in this collection would be this Copacetic Suite, and it's actually 8 prints that came out of a public art commission where I had made, I think, 64 blocks to create 16 images that were then transferred into glass for public subway, for the Metro North subway station up in Harlem. But then it was great because then I was able to take those same blocks and actually create prints out of them. And so again, I worked with Paul Maloney on doing these, and they're in a really beautiful portfolio if you can have all 8 of them. But I was really interested, the series was kind of, when I went back to Harlem, after having been there in the 80s, working at the Studio Museum, as I would go back, you just see now it's kind of got like, TJ Maxx and Starbucks and all of those places, all those great soul food restaurants and all those great kind of like churches that would have lunches that you could come and buy were gone. And so I really wanted to kind of look historically and kind of create these sort of historical sort of monuments, to the music industry of Harlem. And so all of these are kind of visions from the Harlem heyday. We've got Torch Song, we've got Haint and Hooch, we've got Jitterbug, and we've got Hepcat. And so, again, in this case, these are kind of different from the rest because the background is really kind of they're actually in a place and time. And if you go through the other pieces, you can tell they're very much you can tell they're prints of sculptures, like images taken from sculptures, but these ones kind of have their own space and time, and it was great because then I was able to really kind of create these I think of them as kind of music that you could kind of feel their bodies dancing, kind of pushing the atmosphere around them, and how the atmosphere is kind of like being affected by them. And so this was just a really refreshing opportunity to work in more than like 2 or 3 colors, and again, to kind of really play with that background as well. So I was really happy that for this venue we were able to include some additional sculptures from Jordan's collection, 2 of which were from this year. And this one, Set to Simmer, I thought was really kind of a nice way to kind of create this sort of full circle to the collection. And so, it's playing off of this odalisque. It's always, a scantily clad female figure usually being observed, in a sort of voyeuristic way of her toilette. And, she's sometimes looking at the viewer, but not being confrontational. And, it just felt really kind of seamy that you're kind of like, drinking this figure in. And so I wanted to create an odalisque that challenged that gaze. And so, she's laying on the kitchen table, titled Set to Simmer, is this kind of like something's just below the boiling point. And she's inviting you to, if you're going to look at me, don't be looking at me at askance, don't be standing off in the corner like drooling or whatever else you're doing, but to actually come in and pull up the chair. And if you're going to look at me, look at me. Look at all of this. If this is what you need to like get it through your head that I am somebody and something. And so, she's again poised with this skillet. And, is it a mirror or is it a weapon? And, her hair is barbed wire. And then, like most of my sculptures, she's clad in this ceiling tin, which, also kind of, I loved it because it felt like scarification and the traditions of scarification in terms of it being as an identity, but I also love that it becomes this sort of armor. And so you sit down, and then you're invited to look through her drawers, to rifle through her drawers. And this was a really wonderful opportunity to collaborate with Dion Brand, a poet and writer up in Canada. And so I said, I have this drawer, and I see it as, everyone's family, usually grandmothers, has this drawer of things, right? Scraps of paper, receipts, the odd key to a place that nobody knows what it goes to sort of thing. And then, on the bits of string or rubber bands or whatnot. And so I asked her to kind of write these poems to them. And so for this little one, and I didn't tell her what the objects would be or how I was going to actually do it. I was waiting for her to kind of send me these words, and then I would figure out how they would kind of materialize for the piece. She just knew that it was going to fit in the drawer. So the key says 1976, no worries. And then there's this little matchbox that says, what decision is being made at 5 p.m. every day, ? And so all of these things, some of them are on ledgers, some of them are on little cards, some of them little pieces of note paper. I saw a dish filled with jacaranda flowers, 1 dozen eggs, 1 can of gasoline, light bulb, matches, lemons, newspaper. So I just love that this was a chance to kind of get inside her head and sort of understand her in a sort of abstract sort of level, and kind of all those things about us that are left unexplained. Well, what's wonderful when you bring a collection of works that have been created over decades together is, one, you see how things relate and how my mind goes back and forth and revisits things. I mean, I didn't talk about hair in this, but if you go through the collection, you can see I am obsessed with hair. And I think part of that is because, again, my skin being perceived as white and looking like I'm white, my hair is maybe the only thing that kind of belies my ancestry sort of thing. And so that is something that comes and goes, it's something that, Black women have struggled with, trying to press their hair and anglify their hair, and then this embracing of having a natural, and then to the point of having barbed wire as your hair, that, I'm just wild. Stand back sort of thing. And so, you kind of see that, tango to their hair is tied in a knot together. So it's nice to see how these things keep coming up, whether this is something I'm still working out, I don't know. But, and then also it's just really nice because it feels like a family reunion, that these pieces are all together and that they're somehow related, that they've never met before, but it's kind of like this distant cousin that, like, oh yeah, you kind of look like me, or we have these certain things in common. So that's, for me, it's nice to revisit, and especially with the sculptures, because usually when they're gone, I don't get to visit them unless they're in an exhibition somewhere. The prints I get to see more often because I keep a set for myself. But I think that's just really wonderful. And again, it's just great to have them in a place where so much of my own personal history was started. So great, thanks.